Okay, so Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya. We will begin our every class with chanting of Namo Tassa 3 times, and then we will proceed on to the class. So you can join me if you like. You can just chant in your heart. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arhato Samma Sambuddhassa.
Namo
Namo
Tassa
Tassa Bhagavato
Bhagavato
Arhato
Samma
Samma
Sambuddhassa.
Sambuddhassa. Namo
Namo
Tassa
Tassa
Bhagavato
Bhagavato
Arahato
Arhato Samma
Samma Sambuddhassa.
Sambuddhassa.
I think whenever we start any of the Buddhist readings, or if you traditionally look at the Buddhist books that has been written by people, it always begins with this salutation, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. And we also know that this particular chant was constantly recited by Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Some of the people who lived very close to Baba Saheb Ambedkar, they have noted that Baba Saheb Ambedkar used to chant this again and again in his mind. You know, he would murmur it all the time. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. So that's what we will make a precedence here, and we will begin all our sessions with this chant. I think this is very important that we begin our session with this chant. Now, entering into the first book of the Buddha and his Dhamma. As I told you that Baba Saheb Ambedkar had worked very hard to produce this beautiful book. And I told you that there are 8 books, and you can see it for yourself that there are 8 books and it's divided into many parts. So today we are going to look at the part 1 of the book 1. And it's about the Buddha. And we know that there had been immense difficulties in knowing about the biography of the Buddha, because there is not much available in terms of textual material or archaeological material to know about the human being that the Buddha was. And I think that's very interesting. Baba Ambedkar says that we can find the biographies of the other spiritual teachers in the world, but there is very less, because the Buddha didn't talk much about him. In some of the suttas, he referred to some of the events in his life, but we don't have a comprehensive biography of the Buddha. And therefore, thinking about the Buddha's life, we have to rely on several sources. So there are various ways in which the Buddha's life is looked at, like people sometimes call it external biography, some people call it internal biography. People have referred to what is called a meditative biography, the symbolic way to look at the Buddha, and so on and so forth. So there are many different ways to look at the Buddha and the life of the Buddha. And the difficulty has been that there is very less historical material available on the life of the Buddha. And we know that before 200, 300 years, even in India, the Buddha's name was forgotten. Nobody knew who was the Buddha. As a matter of fact, the places like Lumbini and Kapilvastu and Mahabodhi temple, the Burmese knew about Mahabodhi temple and the Tibetan knew about Mahabodhi temple, but we know that it was buried under the mud, and the discovery of the pillar in Lumbini, which was erected by Ashoka, where Ashoka wrote in Dhammalipi, Ida Buddha Jayate, the Buddha was born here. And that's how people came to know that how the Buddha was born here. There's a very interesting story that how the Buddhism was rediscovered in this country. And people had almost forgotten the Brahmi script, and nobody knew how to read it because it was very difficult to decipher. And then Jem Prinsep was working on the script, and his friend was working on Tibetan, and another friend was working on Sanskrit. And there was one formula which was getting repeated all the time everywhere, was He Dhamma Hetu Pabbhava, Tesang Hetu Tathagato Aho, Tesang Cha Nirodha, Evam Vadi Mahasamno. This formula, He Dhamma, it is called He Dhamma Hetu Pabbhava. So very simple meaning is that whatever has the origin, cause, the Buddha has explained the cause of origin, and Buddha has explained the cause of its dissipation. I think that's the formula which helped the linguists to unlock the Dhammalipi, and that's how they started reading the Ashokan scripts. And that's how people came to know that the Buddha was. And of course, the Chinese travelers kept the travelogues like Yuan Song and Fai Han, when they came to India, they maintained very meticulous records of where they have gone. They have walked this many distance in each direction, and there was a big stupa. And they went this direction, and there was Vajrasan, the Buddha Gaya, of course. So I think this is, that's how the Buddhism was reconstructed, rediscovered in the modern times. And people in the West used to believe that the Buddha is some kind of a sun god, and there were a lot of mystical stories about the Buddha. So I think looking at all these difficulties in understanding the life of the Buddha, and more information is being now available about the life of the Buddha. There are Tibetan sources, there are Sanskrit sources, there are Prakrit sources, there are Gandhari sources, there are Pali sources. Increasingly new information is coming up. So what we have to look at when we study the Buddhism is Baba Saheb's that unwavering faith in the Buddha. And he tried to communicate that unwavering faith of his to us through this initial books about who the Buddha really was. And I think that faith of faith of Baba Saheb Ambedkar in the Buddha, if we can even get a little bit glimpse of it, we can see that opens up a new door for us. For example, we know that Baba Saheb Ambedkar was very fond of remembering Buddha all the time. And his biographers have told us that whenever Baba Saheb Ambedkar talked about the Buddha, his eyes were filled with tears. And, he used to say that my Buddha, he made it so personal. The Buddha was so personal to Baba Saheb Ambedkar, just like it was for Ashoka. Ashoka used to call Buddha my Buddha, our Buddha. And so we can see that this tremendous love, this tremendous faith in the Buddha. And it was not something which was new to Baba Saheb Ambedkar. It was instilled in him when he read the biography of the Buddha written by Dada Saheb Keluskar very early on in his life. And we know that Baba Saheb Ambedkar used to chant Pali chants, read Pali text, reflect on the life of the Buddha, talk about him all the time with his attendants and with his friends. And he wanted to, he sculpted some Buddha statues, which you can see in Milian College. I've been there, and I saw it myself in his room. It's like a stupa, and there are lots of beautiful Buddha images. He was always like to be surrounded by the Buddha image, always. Even in the Rajgruha, there was a beautiful photo of the Buddha that people have mentioned time and again, starting from 1935 and so on and so forth. So and we know that Baba Saheb Ambedkar had this open-eyed Buddha sketched by himself. So his faith in the Buddha was tremendous, and that's what he tried to communicate us. His faith in the Buddha in this book one, and throughout the book that when we read Buddhism, because it's very important for us as on the individual level, on the social level, to connect ourselves to that man who brought revolutionary changes in the world. And to know the Buddha as a human being is something that has been very, very beautifully attempted by Baba Saheb Ambedkar. As I told you that there are several biographies, like there are symbolic biographies, what is the meaning of the lotus, and what is the meaning of his Ushnisha and whatnot. There are a lot of technical biographies also that we can get into. There are so-called spiritual biographies, inner biographies of the Buddha, as to what he might have thought inside his mind and so on and so forth. But I think here the attempt of Baba Saheb Ambedkar is to connect us with the human Buddha, the Buddha in the flesh and body like us. Now, we have to bear in mind some of the qualities that Baba Saheb Ambedkar liked in Buddha. And one of the qualities that Baba Saheb liked in Buddha was his Mahakaruna. And very early on in this book one, Baba Saheb Ambedkar talks about the compassionate nature of the Buddha. And it's very significant to see that Baba Saheb Ambedkar highlights it from the beginning. The second attribute, I think the quality of the Buddha that Baba Saheb Ambedkar cherishes is the Buddha's love for peace. And we see that from the early on when the book takes off from the book one, we see that, Baba Saheb Ambedkar is trying to bring about this very beautiful aspect of the Buddha, the peace, the aspect of peace. And profound peace, it's not just an ordinary animal peace at one level where, nothing is happening, but that profound peace from which everything can be done on a very creative level. So two aspects, I think, has been always shining through this attempted biography of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. And I think he has done his job wonderful. The language is beautiful. He has drawn from Ashwaghosh, Buddha Charitra, Lalita, and other Pali text and whatnot, Chinese Dhammapad, and a lot of things he has drawn on from. But I think the way he has really structured this book, this part one, and this, you see the title of the book one, and I think the title itself is significant for us to understand. Siddhartha Gautama, how a bodhisattva became the Buddha. This is the title of the book one. This is a book in itself. So it's a journey of a bodhisattva to become the Buddha. Then we have to know who is Siddhartha Gautama. So this book, as it starts with very beautiful discussion about the political background at the time of the Buddha, because Baba Saheb Ambedkar needs to situate the political situation in which the Buddha was born, and there is very profound discussion on the political developments, and I would say political powers at the time. So of course Baba Saheb Ambedkar takes us to the 6th century BC. Now 6th century BC is a very long period of time if you look at it now from our perspective, and then he talks about many different states, their form of governance, polity, and so on and so forth, and he talks about the Sakyans and the Koliyas, and he goes in depth about talking about the politics, the polity of Sakyans, as to how it was connected with there were two big empires that time. There was a Magadhan Empire and there was a Kosalan Empire. One was headed by Bimbisara and one other was headed by Prasenajit. And Kosala Empire, the Sakyans were connected with. So why this background of the story, the political background of the story is so important for us to understand, because we have to situate the human personality of the Buddha in that situation, in that time. So I find it very interesting that the discussion on the Buddha begins with the sort of a political framework of that time. And it's a very historical information that Baba Saheb Ambedkar has drawn into. Like, just read it for, section 1 and, the verse 3. The monarchical states were altogether 16 in number. They were known by the name Anga, Magadha, Kasi, Kosala, Riji, Malla, Chedi, Vatsa, Kuru, Panchala, Matsya, Saursena, Ashmaka. Ashmaka is very important. It's in South India. Avanti, Gandhara, Kamboj. So you can get a glimpse of the different governments at that time. And maybe there is also a map that we can look into, that the map of ancient India. There it talks about non-monarchical states like Sakyans of Kapilvastu, the Mallas of Pawa. Very important. These names are very important because why we have to bear them in mind, because they are going to come again and again. Because in Pawa, the Buddha died. In the state of Mallas, the Buddha died. And Mahaparinirvana. Kushinara, Pawa and Kushinara. Lichavis of Vaishali. Very important clan, we understand. Who were the Lichavis? Because there are many sutras that are attributed in Vaishali given to the Lichavis. The Vidyas of Mithila, the Koliyas of Ramagama, the Bullies of Allakappa, Kalingas of Resaputta. Now, why this political framework is important for us to understand is because then a lot of these things that Buddha has done throughout his majesty of 45 years, he has gone into different parts of India and talked about it. So that's how we have to situate our mind also in the geographical area. And I think that's very important for us to understand. And that stands at the beginning of the Buddhism. Then, of course, his ancestry. So who are the Sakyas? Because the Buddha is known in the world as a Sakya Muni, Sakya Sinya. And this word Sakya is so famous that the Japanese Buddhists call themselves Shaku. Shaku means Shakya. And in Chinese, the Buddhists call themselves Vishya because they don't have the word for Shakya. They call themselves Shya. So anywhere, if you meet some Japanese and if you find that Shaku is a name attached to them, it means that they are Buddhists. They are Shakya. So you can understand this word Shakya has traveled all over the world. The Shakya Muni, the Shakya Sinya, these words are so, they have become the part of the now global vocabulary. So you can imagine that Baba Ambedkar is trying to situate the Shakyans as to what was the capital. The capital was called Kapila Vastu. Vastu means soil, according to some biographies, and where the Kapila was born. Now, who is the Kapila? Kapila was the founder of a philosophy called Sankhya philosophy, the numerical philosophy. And the Sankhya philosophy was so famous that there were ashrams in India that time. And Alara Kalam, who was one of the teachers of Siddhartha Gautama, was based in some record says that his ashram was based in Kapilvastu itself. And then there is a mention of one teacher of of Buddha, Bharadwaj, who was a disciple of Alar Kalam. And we have to know this because we have to situate the family of the Buddha, how many brothers, how many cousins, and how many aunties and how many uncles and so on and so forth. So, we can get a very human sketch of the Buddha here. Baba Ambedkar, in fact, traced his ancestry here. There was a Sakya by name Jayasena, and Sinau was his son, and Sinau was married to Kachan. So the Sinau had 5 sons: Shuddhodhan, Dhotodhan, Sakkodhan, Shuklodhan, Amitodhan. Now this is very important. Odhan. The word is very important. Odhan. Odhan means rice. In Pali language, Odhan means rice. So Shuddhodhan means is a pure rice. What is Sakkodhan, Shuklodhan, Amitodhan? So we have to see these words are also very important, because the words, if we look at if we trace the etymology of certain words, we will know that very different picture comes to our sort of understanding. So I think these words are also very important. Kapilavastu. Why Kapilavastu? Why the name Shakya? Also there are definitions of Shakyas that some of you can take it as an assignment. And then of course these all names are suffixed with Odhan, which means rice, and pure rice. The Buddha's father's name was, if we can translate, pure Shuddhodana. Of course, Gotra he talks about, and Shuddhodhan married to Mahamaya and Mahaprajapati, and so on and so forth. I think this particular depiction of situating Buddha's family and his ancestry is so important for us to really understand the Buddha's human dimension. Now there are stories, lot of stories about the birth of the Buddha, and there are supernatural stories about the birth of the Buddha, that a pure being like the Buddha has to be born to a virgin mother. So some of the biographers have tried to put the miraculous birth of the Buddha. But you see here, Baba Ambedkar, I think this very if you look at the section 3 and verse 6, it looks very small verse, but I think it's very powerful. It smashes a lot of things. Like he says, that night Shuddhodhan and Mahamaya came together, and Mahamaya conceived. So we can see that it's not, we cannot attribute that miraculous birth to the Buddha. To many traditional Buddhists, this line itself might come as a shock, that the Buddha was born naturally like all of us. Because they like Daiwine, there was a conspiracy in the Tushita heaven to make Sumedha into the Buddha, who was waiting in Tushita heaven to just descend down on the earth, and it was already planned and all. But these are all mythical stories. They are very beautiful to read, but unless we connect with that human dimension of the Buddha, it's very difficult for us to relate with the Buddha as on the level of human beings. So this is very important. I think this is very striking, that this 6 words, that night Shuddhodana and Mahamaya came together, and Mahamaya conceived. Lying on the royal bed, she fell asleep. While asleep, she had a dream. So these dreams have a lot of interpretations, and there will be a lot of dreams in the Buddhism. The Buddha himself had a dream before his enlightenment, and we are going to look at the Buddha's dream before his enlightenment. But Mahamaya also had a dream of an elephant with 6 tusks coming into and conceiving, entering into a womb. There are different interpretations of that the 6 elephant, it means it signifies the 6 directions, because people used to talk about the 6 directions, the 4 directions, and up and bottom. So it's like universal sort of attribute of the dream of the Mahamaya, and we can talk about it, but there is not much we can think about it, except that this is a religious book that we are reading, and some of the things that we can take as imagination of a poet, or sometimes this imagination are very important for us to really bring something out of us. So now I think this dream is very important, and there is of course Sumed, who is taking birth and last birth, and I think then there is a prophecy of a Buddha becoming somebody bigger or greater. why I think these stories are important, because in a sense that the human beings love stories, human beings love fantasies, and some of the scholars says that we don't know whether the Jataka tales are the real tales, but they have an educational value. If you read the Jataka tales, they are like psychodrama. They communicate as something. They are vehicles to communicate the qualities of the Buddha. When we talk about the Dana or a Shila of the Buddha, the Jataka stories, if we read them to the children, or even if we read it ourselves, they are full of wisdom. They are full of communication of the deeper values. So I think we can read these stories, the dreams and all, and we can understand their efficacy as to what do they mean. So coming to, I think, the Buddha's birth, very beautifully explained. Buddha's birth. There is a Shala grow, and Mahamaya desires to go to her mother's place. That was a custom, still is a custom, and she goes there, and there's a beautiful garden, and that description of the garden is so beautifully done by Ashwa Ghosh in the Uddha Charitra, that you actually enter into that garden yourself imaginatively. Here also Baba Saheb Ambedkar has beautifully taken up those lines. You see this verse, very beautiful. Mahamaya alighted from her palki and walked up to the foot of a royal sal tree. Now this sal tree comes again and again. I wish, I have seen the sal tree. It's very beautiful. It's very majestically beautiful tree. And you can imagine that kind of a grove where, the queen Abhaya, whose mention also comes in Buddha, is the goddess Abhaya lives. And there is this royal sal tree, and she walked up to the foot of the sal tree, and, she's so happy there. And one boughs of the tree, they are heaving up and down. You imagine, now you go in that, you project your mind into that sort of space, 2550, 60 years back, and Mahamaya is going with a palki. She has a desire to get down from the palki, and she walks up to the sal tree, and the branches are heaving up and down. So one bough is coming down, descending down, and she holds it, and she's gently pulled up. And while she is so gently pulled up, she has this pangs of pregnancy, and she delivers a baby standing. You see, so there must be a lot of her maid servants. There must be her sister. There must be her sister Mahaprajapati Gautami, and she conceives a baby. And that was in the year 563 BC on Vaishaka Purnima day. So you can see, this sort of imaginative thinking is so important. Like, we don't have to dwell into poetic imagination for a long time, but just to recreate that situation in our mind. I think it's very important to use that imaginative language, and imaginative thinking certainly has a role in the human life. Then there is, of course, the visit of Asita, and Asita Muni comes and he examines the body of the child, and the gods are singing. Some great being has born in Jambudvipa, and Asita hears that, and he flies actually to the place where the Buddha is, the child Buddha is sleeping. And so there are like these 32 marks, major marks, and I think this is very interesting. A lot is written in the Buddhist text about the 32 major marks and 80 minor marks on the body of the Buddha. His ears are very long, his tongue is very long, and his hands are so long, like that. So I think I remember one Bhante saying that if we really imaginatively try to construct a human being using 32 marks, it will look really strange. But I think we can take it as something coming from the tradition. 32 major marks of a great being and 80 minor marks, and they are defined in the Buddhist text. If you're interested, I can send you a link as to what are the 32 major marks and 80 minor marks on the Buddha. So there is, of course, the prophecy of Asita, where Asita talks about whether, the being like this has only two ways to go. One is to either he becomes the universal monarch, or Chakravarti, or he becomes the word renouncer, the teacher of the world, the Buddha. And he cries, Asita cries, saying that, I won't be there when this child becomes the Buddha. And he asked his nephew Narodatta that he should join whenever the Buddha becomes the Buddha. Rashmi, you have anything to ask? Okay. So, and then Mahamaya dies after 7 days of Buddha's birth. and she hands over that baby to her elder sister Mahaprajapati. And then the Buddha's education. The Buddha started his education at the age of 8, and then he learned whatever there was available. He learned meditation also. That's what Baba Sahib is mentioning here in the section 6, 8, the science of concentration and meditation from one Bhardwaj, a disciple of Alara Kalam, who had his ashram at Kapilavastu. Now these small facts are so relevant. Like if you read the vast literature in the Buddhist world, then you find that these small information that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has gathered and put in the Buddhism are so radical and so important for us. Then early traits of the Buddha. That's how was the Buddha as a child. I think this is something that we have to go into. That the Buddha that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has talked about had this. He was a man of learning, but he never despised manual labor. He loved to work with his hands. He loved to work in the field of his father. His father was a rich man having 1,000. His farm was so big that he needed 1,000 plows to plow his farm. So you can imagine that his father was so rich. And despite of that, we know that Siddhartha used to love doing the manual labor. So this, not despising the manual labor is something very important. And this is the practice that Baba Sahib Ambedkar had in his life. He used to do the gardening. He used to work with his hands. Working with hands is very important. These days, we don't work with our hands. We despise manual labor. And I think if you look at the qualities of any Buddhist teacher in the history of the world, they loved to do the manual labor. They never despised the manual labor. They were the thinkers. They were the philosophers. They could dabble with all abstract thinking. They could think about all complex thoughts, but they never despised the manual labor. And I think that's one of the qualities of the Buddha that Baba Sahib Ambedkar is bringing out. I think, as I told you, that from very early on, Baba Sahib Ambedkar is very focused on bringing out this quality of Karuna, Mahakaruna in the Buddha. And as a child, I think, you can imagine that very early on in his biography, this section 7 and the verse 20, I will read for you. He tried to induce his companions to join him in practicing meditation. He taught them the proper pose. He taught them to fix their mind on a subject. He advised them to select such thoughts as, may I be happy, may my relations be happy, may all living animals be happy. Now this verse 20 is so important because if we unpack this particular verse, we can find out a lot of beautiful things there. That what kind of thoughts that we need to cultivate in our mind. The very compassionate thoughts like, may I be happy. Of course, unless you cultivate that compassion for yourself, you cannot really cultivate compassion for others. May my relationship be happy. May all living animals be happy. So we see what Baba Sahib Ambedkar is trying to get it at is bringing us very close to the human Buddha that he was. Not some kind of fictitious or imaginary Buddha that we often see in the Buddhist texts. There is nothing wrong with it. There are ways to understand those Buddhas also. But I think here the Baba Sahib's purpose is to really connect us with the Buddha on that level. So it's like the understanding the man, so that we can practice, so that we can imitate that man. Now, also the verse 24. I think it's a very radical verse, and we have to read it, and I will read it for you. This verse 24 says, Siddhartha believed that meditation on right subjects led to development of the spirit of universal love. So if you meditate on the right subject, so there is a lot of discussion about what is subject in the Buddhist philosophy. It's sometimes called technically alamban. What is an alamban? What is the object of mind? Okay, you can right subject, object, whatever we can say, led to development of the spirit of universal love. So any reflection, any meditation on the right subject that leads to the spirit cultivation or development of compassion in you, that's a right meditation. He justified himself by saying, now listen this carefully. When we think of living beings, living things, we begin with distinction and discrimination. It's natural human thought that whenever we look out in the world, we think, oh, they are mine, they are not mine. We begin with the distinction and discrimination. We separate friends from enemies. We separate animals we rear from human beings. We love friends and domesticated animals, and we hate enemies and wild animals. Now listen carefully. Verse 25. This dividing line we must overcome, and this we can do when we in our contemplation rise above the limitations of practical life. So, in the practical life, we have to, of course, know that they are, these are our people, in a sense, they are my relatives, they are my friends, they are my domesticated animals, so on and so forth. But they are practical things. But we have to rise above the limitations of the limitations of the practical life and really look at the world from that, limitless compassion. And this trait is inbuilt in the Buddha from his childhood. So you see, his childhood was marked by the presence of supreme sense of compassion. Now, one quality of the Buddha that Baba Ambedkar so much, we know that Baba Ambedkar was one of the most intellectual persons in the history of the world, I would say. His reading, his intellect, same is the true about the Buddha. If you look at the philosophical discussions that the Buddha had, we cannot but get mesmerized by the kind of thinker that the Buddha was. But here you see the quality that Baba Ambedkar admires in the Buddha, the presence of supreme sense of compassion. What a feeling that this word generates in us, supreme sense of compassion. And during the time when Buddha he used to go to his father's farm. He will sit under the tree. He will enjoy the beauty of nature, because Buddha was also the lover of the beauty. While so seated, once he was sitting, the story we know all the time, the story of Devdatta and Siddhartha. It's a very beautiful story that we read. That's, I think, perhaps the only story that we read when we are growing up about the child Siddhartha. That when the Buddha is sitting under the tree and one bird. Now that bird is, some people say it's swan or whatever, but Baba Sahib says that bird. So whatever bird. So we know that is how the story goes, and we are all are familiar with that story. I'm not going to, but you read it yourself. And the argument and the argument at the end of it, when they go to the court and there is an argument, and what Buddha says, and I think this is a very important line in the verse 34. How can he who wants to kill be the owner? Now, this statement that the statement is so beautiful. How can he who wants to kill be the owner? How can those who try to exploit be the saviors? I think Buddhism is full of so much witty aphorisms that we can just take them out. They are like gems that we can take them out, write somewhere, and contemplate on them. You see this word. How can he who wants to kill be the owner? So then, of course, in the part one, there is a story of his marriage, very very romantically told, and there is his father's attempt to keep Siddhartha in the palace, not letting him go, and there are like very beautiful description, and that has to be read by yourself. There is a beautiful imagination that you can go into, and I would recommend that there is, of course, some of the things that have come from the patriarchy, like sentence like this part. This section is women lack that they pursue, not that youth is fickle. Actually, it's not about women, it's about everybody. Actually, that is the Buddha's teaching, when Buddha's understanding when he's in the company of the women offered by his father, and he realizes that how fickle is the world. How can I relish in this world? How can I live in this world? And I think this is a general statement that we have to take up. Then there is this character that we have to know, Kaludain. He was a very close friend of the Buddha, Siddhartha. And it is said that Kaludain and Siddhartha was born on the same day. They grew up together, and he was like a close friend that the Siddhartha had when he was growing up. And Shuddhadana asked him, his name is Udain here, but his original name is Kaludain. So he asked Kaludain to go and convince Siddhartha, to enjoy this worldly life. And there is a beautiful discussion in this thing. I think these verses are to be read again and again because they are so touching to us. The discussion between the Buddha and Kaludain. One verse I will read for you. This verse 9. A soul overpowered by passion, believing in falsehood, carried away by attachment, and blind to the faults of its objects. What is there in it worth being deceived? It's beautiful verse. Forget this use of the word soul, but this actually you can use this man or whatever, or women or whatever, overpowered by passion, believing in falsehood, carried away by attachment, and blind to the truth, blind to the faults of its objects. What is there in it worth being deceived? It is going to deceive us. If any object is marked with these qualities, it is eventually going to deceive us. So I think this is very, very beautifully written. Literally, it's, if you look at in the literary point of view, it's very beautifully written. Of course, Baba Ambedkar has read Buddhist poetries and Ashok Ghosh and Lalit Vistar and whatnot. So you can see that this poetic dimension of this writing is very unique. This is unlike any other writings of Baba Ambedkar. You can compare it. It's very different than what Baba Ambedkar has written. Now, this entry into the Shakya Sangha. Why this part is important? Because in the Shakya Sangha lies the roots of Buddha's Parivraj. And Baba Ambedkar describes the entire Shakya Sangha. What is Shakya Sangha? Who can become the member of the Shakya Sangha? And how Buddha entered, became the member of the Shakya Sangha. So there is this Senapati rising up in the Sangha and saying like this: Siddharth Gautama, born in the family of Shuddhadhan of Shakya clan, desires to be a member of Sangha. He is 20 years of age and is in every way fit to be a member of the Sangha. I therefore move that he be made a member of the Shakya Sangha. Pray those who are against the motion speak. Now I think this formulation is very important. Like whenever we become the member of some Sangha, any Sangha, we cannot just arbitrarily become the member of that Sangha. There has to be some process. And Baba Ambedkar says that Senapati asked this 3 times and nobody objected. And that's how Siddhartha became the member of the Shakya Sangha. I think this practice, we have to bring it in our today's world also, to have this pleas from the people, has anybody objection to this person joining this group or, like that. So there are like rules of procedures, because Baba Ambedkar was sort of a man who was, the man who understood the processes, the procedures of the Sangha, and he tried to bring those elements of his understanding of the processes of the Sangha in this. Of course, Baba Ambedkar has said that India is not foreign to the democracies, because in the Sanghas in the past, the democracies were practiced. And you see, this Sangha is before the Buddha found his own order, his own Sangha. So there were small Sanghas everywhere, where people used to come together, sit together, discuss together, talk together, deliberate on the issues of the society. So this is a practice of a community. Sangha is not something very, I would say, esoteric. It's a practice of a community. Now, when we talk here together, we are also practicing Sangha. We are, we are in that process of deliberating and discussing and so on and so forth. Now, these conditions, and I think these conditions are very important. You must safeguard the interest of the Sakyas by your body, mind, and money. Tan, man, dhan. You will protect the interest of the Sakyas. You must not absent yourself from the meetings of the Sangha. Third, you must without fear or favor expose any fault you may notice in the conduct of a Sakya. You must not be angry if you are accused of an offense, but confess if you are guilty or state if you are innocent. These 4 rules are even important today, that we can bring them in our organizations. Then how the person is disqualified from the Sangha. You cannot remain a member of the Sangha if you commit rape. You cannot remain a member of the Sangha if you commit murder. You cannot remain a member of the Sangha if you commit theft. You cannot remain a member of the Sangha if you are guilty of giving false evidence. This word, guilty of giving false evidence, this needs itself a lot of thinking as to what does it mean of being guilty of giving false evidence. What is a false evidence? Why it is so important in any community? to, to remain intact, to remain together. Why, it is considered to be a crime against the community, that if you give a false evidence, that you spread rumors about the people, we talk about other people's fault, which may not be true. So I think guilty of giving false evidence, this as a condition we have to think about, contemplate on. So thus Buddha becomes the member, Siddhartha becomes the member of the Sangha. And then there is a conflict between Sakyas and Koliyas. And the Buddha is the one person standing. The Siddhartha is the one person who is only favoring peace. He is not favoring conflict. And his arguments are so beautifully put by Baba Sahib Ambedkar here in the Buddhism as to why Buddha is opposed to war, why Buddha is opposed to conflict. And at the cost of his own luxury, he gives up his empire. He leaves his whole family, just for peace. Never in the history of the world you will find an example of a man who has left his empire for the cause of peace. How wonderful is the biographical narration of Baba Sahib Ambedkar about the Buddha. If we read it carefully, we see that, the qualities of the Siddhartha. He left his kingdom, he left his family, he left his Sangha. Why? Because he stood for the cause of peace. And this particular parts 14 and 15 and 16, they are very important for us to understand. I'm just going to read what Siddhartha spoke to the Sangha. Please do not punish my family. Do not put them in distress by subjecting them to a social boycott. Do not make them destitute by confiscating their land, which is their only means of livelihood. They are innocent. I am the guilty person. Let me alone suffer my wrongs for my wrongs. Sentence me to death or exile, whichever you like. I will willingly accept it. See, he is not afraid of being exiled from his community. He is not even afraid of death when he is facing the question of peace. So I think, that these things, and then there is a description of how the Buddha took the Parivraja from Bharadwaj in the Alar Kalam's ashrama. He left, and how Chanda followed him, and how Kantaka cried on the way, and how Buddha crossed the Anuma river, and he left the kingdom of Kapilavastu and became a Parivrajak. So that's a beautiful story. And then what happens to Ashoka? What happened to Ashodhara? What happened to Shuddhodhan? And what happens to other people in the Sakyan is so important. So I think what is important, I think, at this point when we study the part 1 of the book, one is to really go into these historical facts that Baba Sahib Ambedkar has so beautifully narrated here. So I think I will leave that to you for your reading, because I told you that this is the book that we have to read it again and again, because the more you read it, the more things will come up. And just I would like to compare some things with the traditional accounts, like the Buddha left the home in the night, and that the gods opened the door for him, and Buddha left his palace, and he was guided by so-called gods to go here and there, like that. But you look at the human story of the Buddha. You look at the suffering that he might have gone through when he was leaving his family, when he was leaving his father. Look at his father Shuddhodhana. What might have happened to him? Look at his wife Yashodhara. What might have happened to her? Look at her. Look at his friends. What might have happened to them? So this is what is so brilliant in Baba Sahib's Buddhism, is that he makes Buddha your own. You can feel his family, you can feel his friends, you can feel his companions. You can feel him as a child. You can feel his qualities. You can feel his stubbornness for the truth and peace. That's very beautifully Baba Sahib Ambedkar has narrated here. I found this verse very fascinating. So I'm going to read and conclude with it before we launch onto the discussion today. This is the verse 28 in the section 18, where Baba Sahib quotes Kisa Gautami. Now this Kisa Gautami is different from the Kisa Gautami that we hear in the Buddhist text. She is a Shakya maiden. what she says when referring to Siddhartha Gautama, she said, "Blessed indeed is the mother, blessed indeed is the father who has such a son. Blessed indeed is the wife who has such a husband." So with these words of Kisa Gautami, a Sakya maiden, I will stop here and we will open the class for the discussions and comments.
Thank you so much, sir. So like there are some questions in the chat as well. And after that, we can also take questions. Whoever wants to ask a question can raise his hand and can unmute themselves. So first, should we go for the chat questions?
We can go for the chat questions. What I'm thinking is, we talk in relationship with the book and the part we are dealing with. Otherwise, our discussion will go off the track. So though I would very much like to see this question, how do we see soul in Buddhism? I think we will leave it for the future. Okay, very interesting question. I think that is the soul of Buddhism itself, if we can use that word. So I think we will postpone that. What is Milner's question, sir? The Brahminical Academy and discourse based on dichotomy objective and so they themselves being objectives and the operational are being subjective, and while for ours are both subjective. Is how to understand binary objectivity. We don't follow any binaries as it were, because that is what the Buddha has taught us in the first discourse. Nadve ante pabba jitena sevitabba. Means those who have gone for, they should not go to the two extremities. Dve ante, two extremities. Katme dve. Then he says which two? So he says kame sukam sukha lukanu yogo and attakil matanu yogo, like overindulgence in the materialism and overindulgence in the asceticism. Now this has been further extended to eternalism and nihilism and a lot of different binaries like objectivism and subjectivism and so on and so forth. So as a Buddhist, we use whatever we can, and we don't fall in this trap of objectivity and subjectivity. There are of course beautiful Buddhist frameworks that goes into objectivism and subjectivism, and that is a matter of discussion. But I think today what I'm trying to get it at is a language, and this language is of course a very different language than any other languages used. There are different registers in the languages. So you use different registers. So suppose if you are in the official meeting, you use certain language that you don't use in the home. When you are with the friends, you have a certain register. When you are in religious setting, you have a different register, different language. So I think this language here that we are talking today is a language of I would say the language of I wouldn't like to use the word religion, but it's a poetic language at its best. We will of course go into these things when we go into the Buddhist philosophy, Sadhamma, Adhamma, and Dhamma. Okay, we can wait. I think, as I told you, all the answers cannot be had in one session. What is it? Dishant, what is the point of publishing critical edition of Buddhism by academicians when Boss already wrote the original book for the mass? Isn't being reduced to an academic figure? Do we see? Yeah, good point. Good point, Dishant. I think the Buddha and his Dhamma, it's a light within. If we read it enough and we understand and we practice whatever is said there, it's self-explanatory. We don't need an academic sort of a thing. But some people want to carry on the academic discussion as to from where this has been taken, from where that has been taken. So it's good for them. Let them do it. But for us, it's very important to read Buddha and his Dhamma, to learn Buddha and his Dhamma at its own, without anybody mediating between us and the Buddha and his Dhamma. Because when you interpret something, you already take the punch out of it. So, I think there is a problem of interpretation. You are right, Dishan. Diglossia. Shilpi, what do you mean by the word diglossia? Can you explain it to the people here?
Yes, sir, of course. Jai Bhim to
Go.
all.
Yeah.
Actually, you were referring to the registers now. So, like how we have to take a route of different speech while addressing different context and different concepts. So, informal and the formal concept is known as the glossias. I was just referring and mentioning to that, nothing else.
Good. Good, Shilpi. Thank you so much. How to view dreams of Mahamaya? Now, interpretation of dream is really a complex area because it's like too subjective to interpret the dreams. But I think dreams are they are different realities in themselves, and we all dream, and some dreams we remember. So this particular dream of Mahamaya can be interpreted in many ways, in a sense. And but the concept of six-tusked white elephant. Now, what is elephant? What is the significance of elephant? We cannot, of course, it's not a physical process that the elephant is entering into the womb of Mahamaya. She is having that feeling of purity, and that as I told you, the six tusks represent the six direction, the universal sort of the universality in a sense. So I don't know how to view the dreams of Mahamaya. I don't know many things that how we can view it, but maybe together someday, if something dawns on any of us, we can share it. So I think we ended up with the questions which are typed here. What about, okay, there is a question, is sal tree different from people tree? Yes, it's a different from people tree. It's a different from people tree. You will find that in North India. And I think there is one Buddha in the past who has meditated under Sala tree and attend Bodhi. Because there is also these are stories, the story of 7 Buddhas and their trees. Very interesting ones, they are called Adi Buddhas, before the Buddha. And Ashoka has mentioned about 2 previous Buddhas, Kanak Muni and Kanak Muni and Konan Grama, and his stupas are also found. The Ashoka's grandson built a stupa on one of the previous Buddhas. So I think this is very interesting to see that our Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, is enlightened under the people tree, and there are other Buddhas who are enlightened under the different trees. And I think it's very important that we see the Buddha's link with the nature. He's meditating under the tree. He died. He attained Mahaparinirvan under the tree, and trees are constant. He was born in the nature. He was born outdoors, beneath the sky and on the earth, and holding his mother, holding the branch of a tree.
Sir, can something on the last point?
Yes, Mithal.
Yeah. So as you said that, since there was stupas found of Adi Buddha, so it's again an interesting point, and sort of in terms of that anyone can become Buddha.
Yes, it's
not like any other religions which are like the last descendants of gods and all.
Yeah,
so it again give us a more scientific approach to look at Buddhism.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're right. Anybody can become the Buddha, because the Buddha is just born like us. If we make efforts, we can become the Buddha, but we need to make tremendous efforts. It's not easy to become the Buddha.
Yes, of course.
Are the Buddha born before the Gautam Buddha? See, Tai, we don't know. There is a Buddha Vansa, stories of the Buddha, a very big fat book, which you can read about. The pattern is the same, but the trees are different, the attendants are different, these things. So I think this, as Minal was saying, that the stories of many Buddhas gives us a hope. And the Buddha in other texts, like Sanskrit text, has predicted that all the human beings will become the Buddha. That's his assurance. That is his confirmation that all human beings can become the Buddha. So I think that story, or that whatever it is, it gives us a hope that we can be the Buddha. We can achieve the highest that the Buddha had achieved. We can be awakened. And I think that makes it going to connect us with the Buddha, that, yes, it's possible for us to be who he was. Unlike other religion, that you cannot be a god, you cannot be the prophet, and you cannot be the son of the god, or you cannot be the gods of the god of the gods, like Devadidev, like the Krishna says. This Baba Ambedkar has gone into this discussion in the Buddha and the future of his religion, comparing Buddha with the founders of other religion. Like Krishna says that I am Devadidev, or Jesus says that he is the son of the god, and our prophet says that he is the Paigambar, the prophet of the god, and the last one. So Buddha never makes such a claim. He says that I am born as a human being, and through my efforts I attained Bodhi, and you can also do that. Pankaj.
Jai Bhim, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, one point I would like to highlight here in part 1, section 7 and the 7 point. Though Buddha was a born prince.
7, huh?
Yeah, 7. This in the early traits, this one very peculiar quality that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar highlighted, of asking questions. He said to his friend, can it be right that one man should exploit others? Or can it be right that the laborers should toil and the master should live on the fruits of his labor?
Beautiful.
This arising of this question in the mind of Prince is itself a big thing, basically.
Yes. It is said in some of the biographies, it is said that the Buddha was deeply affected when he saw the toiling masses in the farm of his field. And there is one story that when Buddha was sitting under the tree, and a bird came and he ate the snake, and the snake was eating the insects, and the bird was sprayed over by another animal, and so he saw this cycle of exploitation within nature also. I will find a reference and give it to you. So Buddha was very acutely aware of this this violence in the world, this exploitation in the world. He was very acutely aware of it, and he wanted to really find out the problem to the violence in the world, the problem, the answer to the exploitation in the world, to the inequality, and so on and so forth. Very good point, huh? See, in these classes, we are only going to give us the pointers, but I think the real work all of us need to do. We have to read, we have to think over, we have to bring questions, we have to ask questions. Are there mystical stories in Buddha's religion? Of course there are, because the religion has many stories. But unlike the stories, these are not the stories that you cannot question. You can question the stories. You can use your rational intelligence to question the stories. Like other religion will not even ask, let you question the stories. Like there is the stories of myths of origin, that there was God, and God said, may there be light, and there was a light, and then darkness and light came. I'm just telling you the religious stories. And in different religions there are stories, like there is a story in Hindu religion as to how the 4 varnas came. So you cannot question them. You have to accept them. You are not accepting them debars you from being the part of that religion. But in Buddhism, no, there is enough scope for questioning, enough scope for challenging the stories. So of course there are mystical stories, and we are story loving people, all of us. From our childhood, we love stories, and I think there is no harm in having mystical stories, and with the proviso that we don't have to accept them as the ultimate realities. So if we can learn something from them, we can understand something, that's good. Like as I told you, that Jataka stories are, the stories of the past lives of the Buddha. We don't know, but those stories are so important for us to understand the qualities of the Buddha. His Dasa Paramitas, his highest accomplishment of the Dana Paramita, his Shila Paramita, his concentration. So I think we can take it as an educational material. Ninath, huh? The mystical stories in Buddhism, we can take them as an educational material. If there are no other questions, what I thought, I will just tell you about some guidelines that we will limit the class only for 1 hour. That 30 to 40 minutes I will talk, and then 20 minutes of discussion. And I recommend all of you, request all of you to read through the Buddha and his Dhamma whenever you can. I think we have to cultivate that practice of reading our own texts. If we don't read our own text, who is going to read it? So I think I would encourage all of you to again go back, read it, bring some points. We can discuss in the next classes in the couple of days, and you take down your notes or highlight the part that you like in that. Share in the group. If you have any insights to share when you read. I think that way we will learn very much, and it's we can take advantage of each other's intelligence and each other's experience, so that we learn a lot in the process. If there is nothing, no comments or any other things on your mind going on at the moment, or any comments, it doesn't have to be a question. You can comment also. Okay, Rucha's question: how much importance should be given on 32 marks and 18 minor marks? We don't have to give much importance to this, because the Buddha has said that if you want to see me, you cannot see me through these 80 physical marks. You can see me through my Dhamma. So when you understand the Buddha Dhamma, when you understand Dhamma, when you understand the various theories in Buddhism, you see the Buddha. So to see the Buddha, to meet the Buddha, you don't need these physical marks, because Buddha is not in his hand or in his eyes, in his ears and all, or in his body. Buddha is his mind. So if we can get a glimpse of his enlightened mind, I think that's enough for us. We don't need to give much importance to this 32 marks and 80 minor marks. But if you want to study it, there are books you can study it. And if you want to paint the Buddha based on this description of 32 marks and 80 minor marks, all the best.
हॅलो, थँक्यू मंगेश, थँक्यू सो मच. खूप खूप सुंदर धम्म देसना. खूप म्हणजे अगदी माझ्या डोळ्यासमोर तो दृश्य येत गेला, जसं जसं तू एक्सप्लेन करत होता. अगदी तो आम्हाला बुद्धाच्या काळात घेऊन गेलेला.
Hindi, if you can talk to Hindi and this thing, because a lot of people.
Okay, Mangesh, thank you so much for taking us and giving us this wonderful Dhamma Desna. And I really love to chant Narsya Gatha at my vihara, where there is a explanation given by Yashodhara to Prince Rahula. So should I read one stanza?
Please read, please read.
जिस समय अपने पिता राजा शुद्धोधन के आग्रह पर भगवान बुद्ध कपिल वस्तु पधारे थे, उस समय राहुल माता ने राहुल को इन्हीं शब्दों में तथागत का परिचय किया था. जिनके चरण रथ वर्ण चक्र से अलंकृत है, जिनकी एड़ी सुंदर है, जिनके चरण चरवर तथा चक्र से सुशोभित है, वे जो नरों में सिंह है, यही तेरे पिता है. I really love this lines.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mangesh, for giving me this wonderful opportunity.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Jai Bhim.
You answered the queries very nicely and in easy way. We are very much happy.
We have to explore it together, Thai. In the, I think.
Yeah.
Richa, it's not about my thought, because we just have to text, read the text. I pointed you out that where you can read the description of 32 marks. I can, even if you Google it nowadays, it's very easy to find out what are the 32 marks of the Buddha and 80 marks of the minor marks of the Buddha. This just one story. There was this Buddhist scholar. His name was Bharat Singh Upadhyay. All his life, he was studying Pali and all, but never understood Buddhism. And then he read one passage from, I think, Mahaparinirvana Sutta, where Ananda was, helping Buddha to bathe, because Ananda was like son to the Buddha. So he was bathing Buddha, and he's telling that, once upon a time your body was like a gold, and now it has become so, it's so wrinkled, and it's so wrinkled, and it's becoming so, it has become so old. And reading this passage has stirred something in Bharat Singh Upadhyay, that he immediately started identifying himself with the Buddha. So I think, this sort of stories, small things, like Buddha said that I'm very old now in one of the sutras, and my body is like is maintained like a bullock cart, because that time there were no cars, only bullock carts. So, this axle is loose, that axle is loose, just like that is my body. But my mind is radiant. That's what the Buddha says. My mind is so radiant. My mind is so clear. My mind is so powerful. So we can see that, the body is subjected to the natural laws of birth, death, and disease and whatnot. But I think the mind that we can nurture like the Buddha. So I think, we don't have to go on to this 32 marks or 80 marks, 80 minor marks. If you are interested, you can, of course, study them. That's for you. All right, then, if there is nothing, then we will conclude here today. Nikhil?
I think Yashodhara also got this attained Nibbana because
Yes.
yeah.
There
Because,
are many people who attend to Nibbana. That's a hope for us. Even if Angulimal.
Yes.
Angulimal. If Angulimal can attend to Nibbana, there were prostitutes, there were killers, there were man-eaters, the man-eaters of Alvika. They became Buddhists. They were awakened. So what is it? There is a hope for all of us. Huh?
And she was very, in her last words, she said that I am in my 78 years and Buddha says he is 80. And she didn't take refuge in him. And she said, Attadipa Bhava means I am self-reliant. She didn't take refuge of, she didn't ask for permission of Buddha to die.
Yes. Buddha and Yashoda, their relationship is altogether a different chapter that I think some of you have to study. Now, a lot of new books are coming on the relationship between Yashodhara and Siddhartha. People say that Yashodhara was, equally powerful. Like she lived with the Siddhartha, the man that we are studying. So, how she must be, what kind of a strength of character she might be having, what kind of a person she would be. So I think that's we have to think there is a lot to research, study about Buddha Dhamma. And yes. I think we can do that. But let's concentrate on this beautiful text of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Let's try to make it our own life, part of our life, and a lot of things will emerge from here. Good?
Yeah. Thank you, Mangesh sir and Nikhil, for conducting the session today. And it's really very good to get the insights. We are getting the story behind the Buddha and his Dhamma, right? What Baba Saheb has given the importance on two qualities of Buddha, as you said, the supreme compassion, and the second one was profound peace. So these insights are very useful, and the questions coming up in today's session, small questions which like Mahamaya's dream, how we can interpret it, and it is apart from the traditional, that clarification is needed, and this platform is giving such a great chance for everyone to clear the misconceptions. I really thank you for this initiative.
Welcome. So see you next week. We see each other, and as Pankaj was saying, we can go for next class, book 1 and maybe part 2 and 3. Okay. So see you next time. Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya.
Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim to everyone.
Jai Bhim, Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim, Namo Buddhaya.